president said we had to act in Libya. Is he right?
I think he's wrong. I mean, what are our interests and what are our values? Our values are defending the Constitution. Our interests are not served by starting wars. This is a preventive war. This is going in and saying, well, we're going to prevent something from happening, as if he knows exactly what would happen. And even if we did know exactly, where does the authority come from? You know, I have objected to these other wars that we have been pursuing, but this one might be a little worse because there wasn't even an attempt to come and inform the Congress and say this is what we're going to do. So I think we're taking one more step further with the Congress giving up its responsibilities and prerogatives and giving them over to the executive branch, and I don't like the trend.
Didn't Obama then, I hear your point, but didn't Obama really just take a page out of Bush's playbook, and didn't Bush take a page out of Reagan's playbook? This ain't the first time a president has done this.
Yeah, I think it's on and on. You know, Bush did, both Bush Sr. and Jr. did go to the Congress, even though I wasn't satisfied with that and voted strongly against it, not only because I thought the war was unwise, but I thought if you go to war, you're supposed to declare war and, you know, have a precise goal and a precise victory. So, yes, it's a continuation of it, but this time some people would argue that it's slightly worse because he hasn't even made an attempt to get some type of token approval. And of course, I'm no fan of the United Nations. I don't think we should give up our responsibilities and our sovereignty to an international body to tell us when we should send young people off to war. And then on top of all this, some people actually bring up the subject of the cost of these things, and they're very, very costly. The whole thing is we don't have room to spend hundreds of billions of dollars overseas as we have been while denying so many needs here at home.
Obviously, you opposed the president on going into Libya, but since we've been there for these 9 or 10 days now, has anything been accomplished to your liking at all?
No, I can't think of anything. You know, the more I see, the worse it seems to be. It's likely that there's Al-Qaeda in the group who are rebelling, and once again, you know, we're all over the place. We were buddies with and allies with Osama bin Laden when we were fighting in Afghanistan in the 80s, so we may well you know, be serving the interests of the Al-Qaeda. And actually the State Department hasn't denied this. And they said, well, sometimes you have to, you know, make these type of partnerships when you're fighting an enemy. But who's going to make this choice on who's the worst person in the world? So, no, I think it's a bad move. I think it's bad for our national security and bad for our finances and bad for our Constitution.
Somebody said years ago that the first casualty in war is the truth. The very first casualty is the truth. I raised that because I was watching my friend Brian Williams last night on NBC News. Brian had an exclusive conversation with the president last night. So he sits with the president for about 10 minutes last night for this conversation. And the president suggests in that interview, as he did in his speech, that we've got Muammar Gaddafi on his heels. So the president says we've got him on his heels. After Brian finishes the interview, he goes to their foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. Engel is on the ground in Libya, and these guys are running faster than Jackie Joyner-Kersee trying to get away from Gaddafi. So the president says he's on his heels, but the story on the ground is these rebels are on the run. That's the story again in the news today. So who do you believe about these stories?
Well, I don't generally believe the government. That's a lot of wishful thinking. I don't know if it's outright lying, but it's wishful thinking and deception. But it is true. Our governments, the previous administrations, did it as well, and it's been going on for many, many years. You go all the way back to Vietnam. You know, lies were told to get us involved in these wars. So it is, American people should be much more reluctant. The Congress members ought to be more reluctant to accept this at face value, that, you know, it's the end of the world if we don't go in. You know, Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, and Al-Qaeda was in there, and all this fear-mongering. He was about to attack us. And they were all not, it was not true. So we should be much more cautious about going to war. I mean, it's just, you'd think we'd learn our lesson.
Now, with all due respect to the president, I can imagine that Republicans, particularly you got folk like John McCain and others, who are now calling for the president to help arm these rebels. I'll come back to that in just a second. The point here is that if the president did not do anything in Libya, when our values that we so cherish here are being stomped on in Libya, if he didn't do anything, wouldn't Republicans be saying the president sat on his hands and didn't go defend people when they were being annihilated by their government?
Well, yeah, I'm afraid you're right, and there's still a bunch of them doing that. Why didn't you do more sooner? But we ought to question our values. Our values should be, going to war in a proper manner and for a moral reason under the Constitution. So I don't know how you spread our values and for moral reasons to go and violate all the American principles that were embedded in our American system. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are a bunch. I think we're going to have more Republicans with us now in opposition to this. One, because things are getting out of hand, but also for partisan reasons. This was happening in Bosnia. A lot of Republicans opposed Clinton when he was going into Bosnia, but immediately when Bush did it, they were all for it. So I respect the people who are consistent, and we have a group, both Republicans and Democrats, more Democrats than Republicans, who take a principled stand. The progressive Democrats and some of the libertarian conservative Republicans are opposed to this type of foreign policy on principle.
I hear your point now, and obviously you're Republican and you've been very courageous on this war question for a while now, condemning these kinds of invasions, these kinds of wars. But since you mentioned progressive Democrats, there are a number of stories out all over the place now, and I, for one, am concerned about this myself, that the progressives have not been as vocal about this as they were about Bush going into Iraq. So is the progressive left hypocritical on this issue now?
Well, there are some that I was just shocked they weren't with us, and they had been so strong allies when we were opposing the Iraq War, and then they just faded. But it sorts people out, and find out who the people are of principle. The Dennis Kucinich group, I mean, they're still anti-war and very consistent anti-war. But then there are others that I was pretty disappointed. I just assumed they would be with us, and they have not been.
What do you think about where we are in the Middle East and our involvement?
Well, it's a continuation of a policy that's a very bad policy from my viewpoint for 50 years, ever since World War II, but every year it gets worse. Now we can go into Libya, start another war, be involved. Our CIA's in there. We use drone missiles. And the president is rather arrogant about it. He says, I don't need to ask the Congress for this. Where does he get the money to do this if he doesn't even need to come to the Congress and get the permission? So the wars are perpetual. They're done, on presidential orders. And the Congress really just sits by and lets it happen. And this is connected to our financial crisis. Wars always are harmful and costly, and ultimately they bring down empires, and that's what we're on the verge of. We should look at recent history of what happened to the Soviets when they went in Afghanistan. We've been there 10 years. 70% of the American people say it's time to come home. And it's connected with even monetary policy. If you didn't have the Fed monetizing debt, you couldn't fight these wars because you'd have to tax people. You couldn't have runaway entitlement programs because if you didn't have the Fed buying up the debt, because interest rates would go up and the Congress would have to be restrained and quit the spending. So it's all connected to our economic problems, our foreign policy, entitlement system. So the Fed is the key to the financing of big government and the destruction of our personal liberties.
They're talking about cutting some military spending, which I'm all for. As a matter of fact, I wrote a letter along with some others to recommend this, and they've at least addressed the matter, and they talked about bringing a third of our troops that are stationed overseas. But they're liable to put them into Afghanistan, so I don't think these are real cuts. I just think they're dealing with this in an incorrect fashion. It's not strictly a budgetary problem. It's a philosophic problem, a philosophy of government. As long as we're going to be the policemen of the world, and as long as we pretend we're going to run a welfare state from cradle to grave, it's not going to work. And these figures, how can you rely on these figures? How do they know what the revenue will be? They don't even know what the employment rate will be in a couple years. So I'm not all that hopeful. They're not going to start anything until 2012. They're talking of a total $200 billion cut by 2015. I mean, what does that mean? Last year, the national debt went up $1.6 trillion.
Yeah.
So I'm skeptical, but I'm for all the cuts they have there. I don't think I would vote against any cuts that they have suggested.
If you were to be able to set the North Star, however, for a conversation about not just the deficit, because the deficit obviously is symptomatic of a philosophical operating system in this country, not not just at the federal government, but in the state government and all the rest of it, and for that matter, a financial system, a bond market that indulges the politicians' behavior. Where would you begin the process of correcting it if you think this is philosophically misguided?
Well, I would say that we should have a new foreign policy and bring all our troops home and defend our country and not police the world. See, I think we should look at the military-industrial complex. I think we should look at the empire, because that's unsustainable too. And there's a growing concern about that. And right now we're voting on the DOD budget, and there's a strong sentiment to say, you know, enough is enough. It's time that we start coming home. So, and of course, I told you where I would start. I would start with our military-industrial complex and the foreign policy and these useless, very damaging wars.
Congressman, you disagreed with the Obama administration's decision to go into Pakistan and eventually ended up killing Osama bin Laden. You suggested that this is a violation of Pakistani territory, which it was, obviously, and that we would have been better off to have relied on the Pakistani government to arrest bin Laden and turn him over to us for trial. But given the contentious relationship we have with Pakistan, how would that have been possible?
Well, you know, the question that they asked me is whether it could have been done a different way, and I said yes, it could have been done. You know, when we dealt with Saddam Hussein, you know, we found him in a rat hole, and we just didn't shoot him. You know, we captured him and tried him, and he got hung, and people know where he is. Right now, all we've done is raise some questions and fed the people who like conspiracy theories. But no, the relationship with Pakistan, it's an impossible situation. Here is a country that we worked with. George Bush worked with them, and we captured a lot of bad people that brought over. The people responsible for the first bombing of the towers, they became over and convicted and in prison, and we worked with them. But you say, well, we can't work with them anymore. But we keep bombing them. We kill innocent people there. How can we, at one time, take a country and pretend that we recognize that they're a friend, give them billions of dollars to do our bidding, at the same time we kill people over there, and then the people resent this and they turn against their whole government? I see the whole thing is a mess, and I think that we are going to be in Pakistan. I think that's the next occupation, and I fear it. I think it's ridiculous, and I think our foreign policy is such we don't need to be doing this. So when I talk about doing it differently, I talk about in the context of our foreign policy and not in the fact of whether or not we should have gotten them. Matter of fact, I voted for the first authority. I think what's the real tragedy is that we didn't get them 10 years ago when we could have and should have. And yet we now have spent $1 trillion. We've lost 5,000 people, our soldiers, in fighting 2 wars that had nothing to do with bin Laden. And to me, we have to reassess the foreign policy just like we have to reassess our economic policies here.
The implication of part of the answer that you just gave is that you feel that the Bush administration handled Pakistan better than the Obama administration has. Is that correct?
I think when we went after the bad guys, they cooperated with us. So why shouldn't you assume that they could do this again? But I also understand why the situation is much worse, and that's why you can't see this as an isolated incident. You have to look at this in the context of our foreign policy, why we are having difficulty. Yeah, I do think in some terms, of course, I was a strong critic of the foreign policy of George Bush too, because he missed it. He missed the target in Afghanistan at Tora Bora, and he went off fighting a war in Pakistan. I mean, in Iraq that we should have never fought. So no, but I just said that he was able to at least work with the security and the government of Pakistan, and we got a lot of bad guys over here. And I was just thinking, you know, the way Saddam Hussein was captured was quite a bit different. And I just think there's more questions now than ever. How many stories have we heard already about the killing of bin Laden? I mean, people are supposed to know what their government's doing. And if you ask me exactly what happened, I have no idea, because I've heard so many stories. And I don't know if anybody there on your panel knows exactly what happened on day when he actually died and when they got the DNA evidence and when he was dropped. I mean, I just think that people need to know more about their government.
I do not have any information on that.
Willie, you
sorry to report.
You don't know. Nobody knows. So,
but that's a conspiracy theory that
that's what I feel like just happened. Did you just put out a conspiracy theory, Congressman Ron Paul?
No.
I think what the inept policy invites people to think about conspiracy theories because we don't get all the evidence, and I think that's where we are now. I think there will be plenty of conspiracy theories because we're presented facts that we're changing almost on a daily basis.